Welcome to Scriptural Works, a podcast that engages Scripture in new and innovative ways to produce meaning for today's postmodern world. Co-host Greg Camp, Professor Emeritus, Pastor and Biblical Scholar, and Patrick Spencer, Biblical Scholar and Silicon Valley Tech Executive, employ various interpretive approaches to generate new meaning from ancient text, revealing timeless wisdom relevant for ministers, lay leaders, and interested readers of the Bible. Get more podcast articles and other useful resources at scripturalworks.com. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Scriptural Works. I'm joined by my co-host Greg Camp. Greg, always good to see you.
Good morning, Patrick.
Yeah, we're in for a real treat. Joining us from clear around the globe is Jan Kozlowski. He is in Poland. He is a classicist, and this is actually the first part of a series that we're going to do on Greco-Roman literary influences from a highbrow standpoint in the New Testament that a lot of people actually don't pay attention to. And Jan has written a bunch of stuff on this topic. It's going to be a fascinating conversation today. Jan, great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, I'm really honored and happy
thank
to
you.
join you.
We are as well. So I'll do a quick intro here. You know, this, as I said, is a conversation that is just not on Hebrew scripture, which we've been doing a lot of in terms of intertextuality in the Gospels and Acts in some of our recent series. But it's an exploration specifically around Plato's dialogues. As I mentioned, Jan is professor of classical philology at the University of Warsaw. And he's written a number of articles on this subject, so it's going to be a really interesting conversation. Greg, do you want to do a quick biographical overview of Jan's background before we get started here? And then I'll do a quick ad from our sponsor, and we'll dive into all the details with Jan.
Right. So, Jan, let's see if we have this right. Your specialties include New Testament and early Christianity, Greek and Latin literature, martyrdom, classical reception, mimesis and intertextuality. That's a lot of specialties. And one of your signature contributions for our show today is that you show that Luke, as a culturally educated author engaging in Greco-Roman discourse, which advances mimesis beyond simply intuitive parallels to grammatical structural correspondences. So that's an interesting way that we're going to delve into. You've published widely in, we use a lot of acronyms in this field, so NTS and ZNTW and ETL, and so really good pieces there. One of your impacts is on the key voice in the Imitatio Socrates and classical education behind Luke Acts, which is widely cited in reception and mimesis studies. So we're excited to hear what your perspective is on that for some of our audience who may not be familiar with some of that classical literature and its influence.
These are influences that I think a lot in our audience miss. I miss, quite frankly, and Jan's work really brings that to the forefront, and our audience is going to find it fascinating. Before we do so, and Greg's going to kick us off in terms of the conversation around what is mimesis, because I think that's probably one of the first topics we should cover. A quick ad from our sponsor. Are you ready to take your calling deeper? Abilene Christian University's Graduate School of Theology offers master's, doctoral, and certificate programs designed to equip ministers, scholars, and leaders for transformative service. Whether you're pursuing a Master of Divinity, a Doctor of Ministry, or a graduate certificate in practical ministry, Abilene Christian University's flexible online and on-campus options help you grow in faith and impact. Learn more at acu./GST. That's acu.edu/GST. So Greg, kick us off. What is mimesis? I'm really interested in hearing the explanation from Jan.
Right. So Jan, so for our listeners who are unfamiliar with this term, mimesis and mimesis criticism, tell us what it is and why it matters for reading the New Testament. Explain to us what this term means.
Explain, but I don't use it, just, everything I did was without even this notion. I never used mimesis or criticism, so maybe it's rather you who should tell me what because hypotext, I understand hypotext. That's the main.
Let's use your term.
hypotext, the only category I'm using. So there is an author. Take for example, take let's take yes, James Joyce, Ulysses. So his hypotext, and even it is in the title we have this indication, is Homer's Odyssey. Yes. So without this pointing these references, detecting these references, just you cannot understand what's going on, because the author with his text makes allusions to earlier text and is playing with it, with allusions, echoes, sometimes even quotations, but half quotes, so
Pointing
Good,
out
Greg.
is exactly what many of our listeners would do naturally. If they had read widely in classical literature as you have, you would automatically hear these things in the same way that people who are trained to listen to one style of music can hear it when it shows up in a different style. It's that being able to hear the resonances without necessarily having a theory behind what's happening. And so that's
wait,
part of
wait,
what
wait.
we're looking at today.
And I think this concept of mimesis is, was formulated by Dennis MacDonald. Some in our audience may be familiar with him. And
Great scholar.
your approach is slightly different. You take that intertextual hypotext approach that he does, but I think you take it a little bit further, and you look at a couple terms like density of words and word order and things
Yes,
like
I
that.
am more technical.
Good.
MacDonald is I think that he's a kind of prophet. So he started something very interesting, but very interesting. I think that it's absolutely, he's a game changer, MacDonald, and he started, but uh, it's a mix of everything a bit. So that's my opinion. So he had a lot of brilliant ideas, intuitions, but sometimes it's chaotic. It's his evidence. It's not ordered, philologically. That's what I expect. So maybe yes, maybe not. Rather yes, we suppose. And my aim is to be as exact, technically precise as I only can. But this is is a good ancient literature.
Yeah, and it's a perfect
Very
example
clever
of.
writer.
Yeah, I think of
Very
all the
clever writer.
Gospels, Luke acts is certainly most attuned to the connotations that you draw in terms of more highbrow literature, and Plato in this case. So, why don't we jump into some of your specific examples, John, because they're quite fascinating. And the first one I have written down here, is Luke chapter 23, verse 2, and you have that in Plato's Apology. There's a connection here, and we'll have you walk us through it. For those who are watching YouTube, you can actually see it in the table that we'll be displaying here. But just for our audio audience, I'll read the verse because it's relatively brief, so you have the context. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man inciting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." So there's a threefold accusation here. And you see that there's a connection to Plato's Apology here in this particular case. Walk us through how this works, John. It's really quite fascinating.
And I started to analyze Plato's Apology of Socrates. There are accusers and judges, and these accusations, it states that Socrates is a wrongdoer because he corrupts the youth and doesn't believe in the gods the state believes in, but in other new spiritual beings. We are dealing here with three accusation that has 3 points. And because we have, there is analogy. This man inciting our nation, Jesus, corrupts the youth, forbidding pay taxes to Caesar, doesn't believe in the gods the state believes in, and final, he's saying himself the Messiah, a king, but he believes in other new spiritual beings. So first, form is important in this case, because we have in both cases, this accusation is composed of 3 categories, but they are introduced in Greek too.
Yes.
But 3 participles, we have 3 masculine participles in Jesus, in the Jesus's accusation, and the same in accusative. So every accusation is introduced with the similar participle. Yes, active participle, masculine. So that's the notions, the categories I'm using. So it's very analogous. In case of Socrates, there are only two, but nomizonta, but implicitly three. So
Yeah.
grammatically it's perfectly clear. The content is very similar, even more similar when you start to analyze it. So it's really, not paying taxes to Caesar, and in especially in, for example, in the context of first century Palestine, and so not paying taxes, forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, and introducing and that Socrates not believe in the gods the state believes in. It's much closer because it has the religious dimension. Caesar is God, so and his cult is so if you say don't pay the taxes to him, so don't honor him, and introducing new spiritual beings, so he is the Messiah, a king, and inciting our nations and corrupts the youth. So already we can see that that's analogous. It's important that Rees proved in this article, in this book, but 1 year before in the Novum Testamentum. So he published there an article, Echoes of Plato's Apology of Socrates in Luke Acts. And I think that he proved, so his evidence is very clear, that in the accusation of Peter and John by Sanhedrin in Acts 4 and 5, they are interrogated by Sanhedrin, and it's focused that they say we must obey rather God than man, while Socrates says I will obey God rather than you Athenians, yes, my accusers and judges. So and he proved by a precise analysis, philological analysis, that yes, that it is so similar, that and Apology of Socrates was so widely known and read everywhere in schools. So this flavor, so it's a reference to Apology of Socrates. The content fits, the wording, words, verbs, everything. So why not? So the most rational, the simplest answer is that yes, Luke used Plato's, drawing a analogy between the fate of Peter and John and Socrates, the paradigmatic martyr of the society, of the Greek society, of this culture. So rather, it would be weird if he didn't make this allusion to him, because it was a standard to make an allusion to Socrates everywhere. Now, if you read Acts of the Martyrs, Acta Martyrum, and this literature of martyrdom, so imitatio Socratis motive stands next to imitatio Christi motive. So so it's everywhere, but it starts already here. And the same is with the article with Andrew J. Cowen, Paul and Socrates in Dialogue, Points of Contact between the Areopagus speech and the Apology in New Testament Studies, published in 2021. And he shows too that in case of Paul in Athens, yes, that he's walking in Athens and having conversation with philosophers and other people talking about God. So we have there, it's very, very possible, probable, that also the redaction of this episode is a kind of imitation of points to Socrates. So if we make a cumulation of Cowen observations, Rees and mine and Maria Chodyko, so we can be sure of one thing, that there is a reference and deep going reference to Plato, to Apology of Socrates, so to Plato, that Luke used it, and he used the imitatio Christi motive, imitatio Socratis motive, as we call it, and not only referring to the apostles, but also to Jesus himself. Period.
Portrayed in that way. And Greg Sterling has a book on that, if our audience is familiar with some of Greg Sterling's work, where he argues that Jesus is the exemplary Socratic martyr, if you may. And that's what Jan he's elaborated on some of that in the works that he's published. And I think that leads to the next point that Greg is about to make here. Another question.
Yeah. So with the death, there's obviously weeping. People are very saddened by the prospect of death. And so in Luke, we see, and they led him away. They seized one, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross uh, to carry it behind Jesus. And there followed him a great multitude of people and of women who bewailed and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never gave suck. For they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do this, the wood is green. What will happen when it is dry? Okay, so we have this scene where Jesus is telling them, Don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves. So how does this show up in or imitate the Phaedo with Socrates' death? Is there some crying and weeping that is happening in this?
The end of of Phaedo. You mentioned already the article by Greg Sterling, but it was John Kloppenborg from Toronto University. That there are a lot of similarities to Phaedo. So, for example, that discourse is much longer in Luke, final words of yes, so Last Supper, and Jesus' speech is much longer, 2 times longer than in Mark, in Matthew. So, which fits a lot. Socrates, it's his last. Phaedo is his last conversation with his friends about the immortality of the soul. So that's already interesting. But first of all, Jesus' lack of emotions, that he's painted very differently in Luke than in Matthew and Mark. In Mark, Jesus says that my soul is sad. On the cross, he falls on his knees. On the cross, he cries, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. We don't have it in Luke. Because it doesn't fit the ideal of philosopher who is very who contemptio mortis, yes, this philosophy as meletet hanatu, so he's above it. So his emotions, he's not emotional. Could you imagine Socrates saying that, oh no, I don't to drink this cup, with this poison, but I will. No, he's pure courage. And Jesus is more, but it's unhuman from us. And so it's Jesus is normal. I think in Mark is emotional, is more alive in Mark and Matthew, while in Luke he goes much closer to this. He doesn't fall on the knees. He don't say that his soul is sad. No, we cannot read carefully at the text. And on the cross, he says, in your hands I commend my spirit. He doesn't say, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, God, why did you forsaken me? Hence, the conclusion was that, no, that it was a tradition of noble death. The tradition of noble death, that's ideal of Socratic death, but not directly Socrates. There were no proof that it is Phaedo. The same with Greg Sterling. So other aspects very similar to this Socratic ideal, but no proofs that it's exactly Peter Scare, The Look and Passion and the Price-Worthy Death. It was a book, short book, not that short, but 150 pages, something like this, and still no conclusion. So they invented Socratic ideal, Phaedo's genre, but no Phaedo.
But no direct
So
connection,
we
which is what
lacked,
you do. Yeah.
yes, we lacked the final proof that to give argument that no, not Phaedo's genre, entia non sunt multiplicanda. You multiply some enigmatic terms. What is Socratic tradition? We have precise texts, not as a abstract Socratic tradition. But I understand them because they could not say that it was it. And I found just in comparison, look, we are very close to that's the same chapter. Just we had this 100% analogy to Socrates, yes, imitatio Socrates motive, and Luke, it is only Luke who insert this passage, don't cry for me, weep for yourselves. If we compare the final moment, because that's the same problem, that his disciple doesn't weep for him, but he realizes that he is weeping for himself, because Socrates' death is harms him more than Socrates himself. And I used the criterion C and D, which I invented, common narrative denominator. Listen to it, because I will read a text now which refers, where every word refers to Plato, to Phaedo, last chapter of Phaedo, and this episode from the Gospel, this Lucan insertion. Yes, Lucan insert. After the execution of the protagonist begins, a group of people accompanying him bursts into tears. However, a paradoxical thought appears according to which the proper object of the lamentation is not the protagonist himself, but rather the subject who mourns him. This is justified by the fact that the death of the protagonist constitutes greater harm on the subject who mourns him than on the protagonist himself. Every word, so I could say that's the abstract, the abbreviation of what? And someone was, oh, it fits perfectly. Look.
Yeah.
No. It's, so I can play with someone that is skeptical, but I can play. Oh no, it was Luke. No, it was Phaedo. So I trying, that to him or her to provoke that. Okay, so that's the same, and I conclude that no other known to us ancient text shares these narrative parallels with Luke and Phaedo. Even doesn't close to it. It doesn't exist. Nothing also suggests that we are dealing here with any literary pattern or a common source for both texts. What arguments in favor of this suspicion? The simplest answer is to explain it that Luke, who knew Plato and used it in the same chapter, and in an analogous, we have this imitatio Socrates motive, also here. So that's the simplest. Phaedo was widely known. Plutarch quotes it. We know from Seneca that Cato the Younger and Plutarch too read Phaedo in the moment of his death. So we can gather a lot of arguments, So, but we can ask ourselves, but how do we know that he knew Phaedo? Everyone knew it. So hence the conclusion that we have that he used Phaedo too as a redactional model, and he modeled this episode according to Phaedo. But now we can. This is, I talked you about Kloppenborg, Sterling, Scare. So these other similarities, yes, parallels between Jesus and Socrates, or the way Jesus is painted by Luke. So the best explanation of these similarities between Phaedo, which was, we should know, a paradigmatic text, how to die nobly, the death of a philosopher who overcomes death, the power of death. So it was absolutely paradigmatic text. So the easiest answer is that the whole Phaedo was a reduction, was used by Luke as a redactional model for his passion narrative.
Yeah. Well, then from a reader standpoint, they would have also been educated and immersed in this type of literature, and they would have picked up on those connotations and parallels most likely, which is really interesting. Intertextually, Jan, there's an interesting text that comes before the one we just talked about, and at the end of Luke chapter 19, when Jesus finally finishes that long, never-ending journey to Jerusalem. As he approaches Jerusalem, there's this episode that talks about how he weeps over the city. The days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you, surround you, hem you in on every side. They'll crush to the ground. It sounds a lot like the Old Testament prophetic literature, but it has this concept of weeping. Is there a connection there as well, in your opinion?
No, I cannot see.
No,
just never came to mind, and just yes, Jesus is crying. A few times with Lazarus, he cries. I think Flevit Dominus, the only moment, but I don't see any connection. Yes, because we should be aware that Luke is a painter and he has a lot of colors. If he can mix them, he can use in this place because and already it is connected this exemplification with this dry wood and this humid wood, I don't remember. Yeah, so that's a quote from a psalm. I tried to understand it, and philologically, if I incite someone to do it, because I had in the end of my tongue the taste, of this, but I had to abandon it for something more sure. He's mixing. So we have this Socrates, and imitatio Socrates model. He has no problem to mix it with purely Jewish context, which is enigmatic, a bit enigmatic. The closest context for this whipping. Very interesting. I think that there is something to be said still, but no, I don't think.
You don't see a connection. You're interested.
Yeah,
there is a connection.
Let me ask that in a little different way. In his death, he's saying, "Don't weep for me." So he's like Socrates in that aspect. Does Socrates ever reminisce or kind of weep over the fate of Athens, of the fact that
weeping? No,
he doesn't do that like Jesus does over Jerusalem.
No, because Socrates is a pure philosophical.
He doesn't
discourse,
exude that type of emotion.
He's not, all his behavior is a proof that soul is immortal here already. Wow. Here, so he's above it.
So Jan, we want to take a look at the resurrection and Socrates being vindicated and surpassed. So in Luke 24:1, there seems to be a parallel with Plato's Protagoras and Crito. So now we've come in Luke to Easter morning, and Luke makes a very specific, curious stylistic choice. Can you explain why he might be using the term deep dawn as opposed to what the other gospel writers say?
Of course, yes. That's what is my article about. So that's easy, because you can, and that's somehow that's the proof of how important is this spontaneous lecture during your studies. I made my studies on classical philology because the lecture of Crito was obligatory, was compulsory. So I remembered the expression that appears in the beginning, orthros bathus, so deep dawn. In Mark, which we can accept that Luke uses Mark. He knows Mark, and his narrative base. So in Mark we read that women went to the tomb very early, lian proi, while Luke replaces it to orthru batheos. Orthros is dawn, and bathus is deep. Genetivus temporis, genitive of time. But I knew it from Crito, so we'll return to Crito. Basic instrument I'm using showed that this genetivus temporis appears only one time in Plato, in Protagoras. So only 2 entries in the whole corpus of 11,000, I don't know exactly the number. So this is Luke and this is Protagoras. What's the context? So we have that young Hippocrates comes to very orthru batheos at deep down, I would say, literally, and to the house of Socrates. And he, just to inform him that that Protagoras came to Athens. So this disciple of Socrates comes to his master, who is closed inside his house. We can imagine, so they were really close. These houses didn't have wide, big windows, so it was really kind of bunker. We could imagine that, and ask him, are you awake or you're sleeping? So that's the question. So it appears there. So the combination orthros and bathus appears altogether 9 times in the Greek literature, according to TLG, before Luke. But this genitive of time only there, and only once. And immediately we can see that formal affinity. There are no reason. This is not a common expression. No, there and here and there, but the context is quite similar, because disciples or someone connected with the guy who is closed inside, and asking him, or implicitly asking, because Jesus promised that he will resurrect. So it fits very well the context. And I think that if we accept that there is a reference, but why? But yes, that's absolutely the simplest explanation of that. And we know that one chapter before, Luke referred to 100% to apology, 99% to Phaedo. And I would like also to that what add now a kind of parenthesis, because Steve Rees, in his book The Formal Education of Luke, focused on that we have a testimony of the Roman soldier, so confession of faith. He was truly the God's son. Luke changes it to hutos ho anthropos dikaios en. This guy was just, and that's the last word of Phaedo. And he said that dikaiotatos, that Socrates was dikaiotatos, the last, very last word of the dialogue. So I think, so that's another, if you change God's son, that's extremely important moment. The confession of faith, last testimony about Jesus before his resurrection. And you must have really good reasons to change it to dikaios, just. So, and he said, I quote him, this is the only possible intertextual reference to Phaedo. So in the previous chapter we had Phaedo and apology. So now the simplest choice is to accept the reference to Protagoras. And the context is very, very similar. And it gives here a good literary taste. Just this tension. Is he resurrected as he told us or not? Are you awake or are you sleeping? Because sleep is, of course, sleep of death. So that's from already in Gilgamesh, but then in Homer. So sleep in death are brothers. Yes, a brother, as Homer says. So, but it's not only Protagoras, because in Plato, orthros bathus appears, this expression, this combination appears twice in the whole Corpus Platonicum, appears twice in a very analogous moment when young Crito comes to Socrates, closed in the prison, imprisoned, and he answered, "What time is it?" Socrates is awake, but also, and orthros bathus, deep dawn. And then Socrates asks you, "But why didn't awake me? But just you were sitting, but next to me without waking me up." But similar context. And what is interesting, that Socrates says that he had a dream in which a beautiful lady in white robe appeared to him and quoted Homer, Iliad. So, emati kentritatop hien eribolon hikoio. So, in the third day, you'll arrive to the Phthia with broad fields, fertile. So, originally it's Achilles who will arrive to return home. He won't, but he had some, the quote, tritato, because that's the answer when he will drink the poison. So in 3 days, because he had this dream. But drinking poison in Plato he will be free from the limitations of the body. So it has soteriological, of course, meaning in Plato. So, it fits perfectly. So hence the conclusion. How careful reader of Plato was Luke. Can you imagine that ability
to pick up on these nuances?
Right.
In a masterful? That is for me. It's virtuoso. It's really. But he had to know Plato by heart. To compose it so in such a clever way. So that's the article, and it appeared 1 year ago in Biblica. Published by
That's a great piece. So that's fascinating, Jan. And from a reader response standpoint, it really gets Greg and me excited, or it does me anyway, in regards to what implications that has. Now, we're going to backtrack a bit in Luke's gospel to, the symposium scene in Luke 14. specifically verses 12 through 14 for our readers. We'll throw it up on the screen, but I'll go ahead and read it just so those who are listening to the audio have the context. And then you can talk about the connections that you see with Plato there. He said also to the one who had invited him, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. That's interesting. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Sounds like Luke 4, doesn't it? And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. You have righteous showing up here as well. So, Jan, talk about the connections that you see happening in this.
Yeah.
In this passage.
So, in some aspects, there is absolutely close affinity, similarity between these two texts, and the context is similar. And we know that he used Plato. We know that he used the same topic, similar topic. So he used Luke as a redactional model, but it doesn't give such a good sense like in case of Protagoras or Crito, but just it make more rich our knowledge how he used. So, but I didn't observe any additional sense or polemics or something spectacular. So I cannot, basing on this very probable reference to Phaedrus, I cannot say that he's a kind of virtuoso here, like in case of Protagoras. So just we can add Phaedrus, which is extremely important dialogue by Plato. So even I expected it, because we have apology, we have Phaedo. Where is Phaedrus? Yes, we found it, but just technical observation and conclusion. He used it. He knew it. He used it in a similar context.
So, Jan, you're ticking off a number of works of Plato's where there's these parallels, and they're parallel to both Luke and Acts. So, help us understand what's the benefit of finding these kinds of parallels there. What's the payoff for our listeners who are hearing you make these comparisons?
No, we understand better. We have better knowledge of the ancient author like Luke, who he was. The landscape is completely different than still 4 years ago. Then in the moment when Steve Rees was writing and publishing his perfect book about the formal education of the author of Luke Acts. So, but we know now much more. So what's the benefit? It depends on what are you looking for. So if you are looking for just a historical knowledge, so because we are here on the academical level, yes. So I can have my theological conclusions, and personal, because for me it's the sacred texts. So, but but let's limit ourselves to this historical, obvious for everyone level. So that's it's not my task, to answer that's obvious, because everyone can ask. But why do we want to know more about Julius Caesar? What does it give to us, this knowledge?
Yeah, so some of it is just putting the New Testament, and particularly Luke Acts, into that broader historical and literary context. Luke knows these writings. As we get out to specific passages and what the differences mean, that's up to the interpreter to decide whether the connection is meaningful or not.
It's a masterpiece of literature. And in the 2nd century, I find 2 reasons why somehow it has been lost from sight, this literary character of Luke Acts, for example. One, it was a reality of persecution. So when your father is killed, so then in the name of the pagan gods, so the last thing you want to find in your holy text is the connection between Jesus and Dionysius or Zeus, and then the sacralization of the text, that it's sacred. It's not Socrates, it's Jesus. It's not, because Plato is just a fragment of this. We focused here on Plato, but Plato is not at all only author. Another one is Euripides, which is even more present in this Lucan diptych. So I think that it was and the Gospels, because I'm talking too about John, Matthew, and Mark, about my impression that the very good literature, very different of what we were expecting to, but it's very it's a good literature, and this intertextual approach, which is basically historical approach. We want to understand what the author wanted to say, like Horatius, like Cicero. We treat the same way Vergilius, referring to Homer. So we want to we treat the same, technically the same way the evangelists. So it's a good literature, that makes me a lot of pleasure to contemplate, to study, word by word, reference by reference, giving very, very sophisticated meanings.
We absolutely agree. And the
Right.
more highbrow literary aspect of Luke Acts makes it. Well, that's why I guess I ended up focusing my doctoral studies on Luke Acts. Makes it very fascinating. What you talk about the impact of the education of Luke and the knowledge he would have had of Plato and some of this other literature, Jan. If you focus on the earliest, normally listeners, right, probably listening rather than reading, but because it's being performed, if you may, in a way. But those who listen to Luke Acts being read, did they have that same level of education? Would they have noticed those nuances that Luke, the writer, actually saw or intended when he wrote it? Or his actual listeners picking up on those connections as well?
I don't, because it's not my personal conviction that it was just for reading. Maybe rather that let's take this Theophilus, this addressee. So I think for listening to, it was rather that's my impression, but maybe I don't know studies that were performed made that it was rather the target were rather listeners than readers. My impression is that it's for reading, and obviously, but so this is not an absolute condition, because we can imagine that Luke was above medium level of every epoch has its very special authors, Bach, Jan Sebastian Bach, or other composer was also above, so that's not the real condition. That's not his problem. Someone can get the sense and another one not. But rationally thinking, yes, I think that there was a whole milieu that understood this play on words, these allusions, and for some reasons it disappeared. It had to wait until now, to discover these allusions. Maybe I would focus on this orthru batheos, yes, because it is very plausible. We see this is mathematically precise, orthru batheos, and it fits perfectly.
So, Jan, there's a longer history in biblical studies that emphasizes the Jewish background of the writings and less of the classical Greek literary world. And you're trying to pull us back a little bit to see Luke within that larger Greek literary world. What do you say to those who say that you're overemphasizing Greek sources? Are you really putting the Greek sources at odds with Luke's reliance and knowledge of Jewish scriptures? Or are you just trying to rebalance things a little bit?
I think that our axioma are false. So the way because we have this logic, either or, and there is no dilemma. So it's rather the problem if in our perception. So you ask, now we know that Paul was more Greek and more Jewish, and also Luke was more Greek than thought before and more Jewish, and Josephus Flavius the same, similar. Philo of Alexandria, he's more Alexandria, more Greek, I think, but still Jewish, and my personal view is that also Jesus knew Greek, and I have good reasons to believe that. Believe in the sense, in the scholarly sense, that it was this profile which was at the same time 100% Greek.
Hmm.
I mean, the formation, literary formation, and cultural formation, and you're 100% Jewish was more common than thought before. And Luke is, because we have data now, so we have these guys which are at the same Greek, more Greek and more Hebrew at the same time. So I think that we should change our perspective rather than to make them fit to what we were thinking before.
Right. Get away from that strict dichotomy between Jew and Greek.
It's not either or; it's both.
Yeah.
It's both. Yes, it's both. But
And as you say, it's more of both.
yeah. So it's turbo Greek and turbo Jewish, and but no either or logic, no more.
Yeah.
So Jan, this raises. I mean, we got these wonderful intertextual connections or allusions, as you've noted. But you get a standard study Bible, or even go to lectures in university or seminary. Quite often, they don't pick up on those. What can we do to rate outside of doing podcasts like this and all the wonderful pieces you've written, which are very accessible? They're not like 50-page articles. Many of them are 4 or 5, 8 pages, so they're quite accessible in terms of length for audience purposes. But how can we raise awareness, in just those who are interested in reading the Bible, those who are teaching it, those who are preaching it, those who are learning it in the seminaries? How can we raise awareness? Do you have any ideas there?
So it's first of all, it's my task in a very limited sense. So I'm doing my job, and my job is done, thanks God. But I can give you one example of a guy in Poland. Now, during pandemia, a professor from Jagiellonian University in Krakow appeared. He started to publish his lectures to the students during pandemia. His name is Marcin Majewski, and on everything Bible. He's a very good Hebraist, biblicist, yet Ugarit, everything, erudite guy, and he becomes terrifically popular. So you can imagine that Poland has some 38 million of inhabitants, but you can imagine that his movie on Qumran, first part of 1 million entries, of views, 1 million
Oh,
in
wow.
Poland. So he's
Wow.
a friend of mine. Yes, but we met on conferences, and now he has many millions. I think that altogether is maybe 10 millions of about Qumran, the Pentateuch. So I think that the answer is very easy. If Marcin in Poland, Majewski, says something about this, so it immediately changes. But it's my court, yes, in Poland. But it needs time. First of all, because Marcin Majewski, so he's a popularizator. How to say, the guy who makes at the same time, he's very popular. So so it's about, I think, the podcast like yours and biblical podcast, this conversation. So it needs time, and it will arrive day by day, month by month, year by year. 10 years by 10 years, because the tempo in biblical studies is not that fast as in science, for example, or AI.
There's a couple of things that I hear you saying that I really hope people pick up on. One is that Luke Acts is culturally very sophisticated literature. It's good Greek literature, but that
Original
literature, and that we really need to understand how Luke is engaging his culture. He's not just writing to some peripheral group, but he's engaging people who might be hearing this as he hears it. And that we need to get away. The third thing is that we need to get away from thinking of either Jewish or Greek as if they're separate realities, that somehow there's this new reality. So piggybacking on Patrick's question, how do you get this idea across to help people begin to change their views of what Luke is like, that he is a sophisticated Greek Jew who understands scripture, but he also understands Plato and other kinds of writings? What do you do to help popularize that?
publishing another articles on that, because my target are academics. This is my target. It's very selfish perspective and very egocentric, but I think that it's healthy, it's normal. So I have to be a bit loco, a bit fool, about this, be self-confident in a exaggerated way. So to go with this like this, but it's a part of my job to be like this. And my target are academics. But you asked before, what can we do in a more faster way, so like this Marcin Majewski, the guy. But I don't care really, about this, because I tell it my students. Oh, as for me, you ask me, I'm a guest in a radio broadcast every week in the morning, which discusses philological. With one theologian, we discuss in the Catholic Church readings,
Interesting.
in the morning. So I
Sounds
say
great.
that in Hebrew, so that's the word, this word or that word in Greek. So so for example, if just one example, if Jesus is born, he's wrapped in this cloth, yes, of the little child. But in the iconography, Eastern iconography, it's his funeral. So this shroud, like a shroud. But in Luke, we have syntactically the same structure there. When Joseph of Arimathea takes the body of Jesus and wraps it and puts it not in fatne but in the mnemeion, and then so the whole structure is similar. So I explain to people ones who are listening to the radio things like this, and I think that just to incite the curiosity about this. So there is a direct connection between this popularization of Qumran and Luke. So I don't think that's the only. The problem is that to popularize the Luke and Plato. So but in Poland we are in a very good moment now, because as you know, we in Poland we didn't have historically. So I mean, neither positivism or reformation in that cultural sense. So now it's galloping, because Poland is a Catholic nation, but it's a kind of popular religion. I mean, natural, and but now it's galloping. So even if
Hmm.
less people go to every Sunday to church, statistically, but not that
Hmm.
much. It's now trends are different now,
They're changing.
are changing, and it's a bit growing. So but the interest on biblical studies is galloping. I
Hmm.
told you about these millions. So
I
how
agree.
is it possible? Million
Yeah.
views, or million 100 now about Qumran, and this the guy Marcin Majewski. But it's important, he's invited now to very popular programs in TV show, on other podcasts. So we are joking now that maybe he gonna be no the politician, but but only that we this situation in Poland, because you asked me, so
Right.
I asking what's going on now. And not only him, lot of guys, and hundreds of youths. Professor Niesiołowski Spano, a very good biblical scholar, my friend and co-author of my articles, Sławomir Poloczek. We published one article in Vetus Testamentum, and in ETL in Leuven. So it's going. From my perspective, we live in a golden era.
Hmm.
Sounds like
That's
an
great.
exciting time.
Great. So, Jan, we're about to wrap things up, but for our listeners and viewers, what's next in terms of the explorations you're doing? We obviously didn't touch on everything you published. You published other things like Acts 17, connections there, Luke 1, you just alluded to that. You have other stuff that's out there, so we haven't covered all the research you published. But what's next on the horizon? What's coming up?
Yeah. So to be concise, yes, common things. So in Biblica, about Carmen Christi, so with my friend of mine, Filip Doroszewski, we put forward the arguments, the evidence by Benjamin Cover. in Harvard Theological Review. So he wrote an article on the similarities, formal similarities, and thematical between Bacchae by Euripides and Carmen Christi. Yes, Philippians 2. And we added, very important arguments. So we nailed it. With Philip Doroszewski. So in this issue of Biblica, yes.
Wonderful.
With the same Philip Doroszewski friend of mine, now in New Testament studies, there will be Zacchaeus Bacchaeus, so that there is in the episode of Luke 19 with Zacchaeus, we have a clear reference to Bacchae, to Pentheus on the tree.
Oh, interesting.
And in a dialogue, so it gives very, very sophisticated sense, because Jesus is imitatio and emulatio. So he shows mercy to the sinner instead of massacring him, because Pentheus, he recognized his fault. Hamartia, but it's too late. For Jesus, it's not too late, never too late. So it gives another perfect sense. And few other things. I'm focusing on Euripides now.
Interesting. I'll do a whole different show on Euripides.
I would be honored, and it would be a very, very big pleasure, because even I asked AI to generate an icon with Jesus Christ in the middle, and in the shadow, two saints, Euripides and Plato, a kind of icon. But it is waiting for a really important theological reflection on the inspiration, about divine inspiration. Because if we have many references to Euripides, also in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, Vetus, and Homer too, and Plato and other, Aesop. But first of all, I think Plato and Euripides, let's focus on them, because that's why I asked AI to produce this icon. But it's a very important and serious question for theologians to answer it.
Yeah.
Or to try to some. And if Paul in his first Christological, Carmen Christi, and morphet heuchy parchon, he was being in the form of God, etc. Everyone knows it. Philippians 2 is referring to Euripides and the relation between Zeus and his son Dionysius. So for theologians, it's crazy. So my work, I did my work. It's done. I'm not a biblicist nor theologian, only amateur. So I feel free to speak about this like this. But if you start with serious theological reflection, it's gonna be. I don't know what it can be.
All right, we're gonna have him come back. We're out of time, unfortunately, Jan. We are exceedingly grateful for the time you spent with us.
Very much.
Fascinating conversation. Our listeners are going to be pushed to think beyond their typical boundaries of how they approach the text in Luke Acts, and this is going to be fruitful for them. And it certainly was fruitful for us. So, Jan, thank you. For our listeners, thanks for joining us. As always, you can check out other podcast episodes on scripturalworks.com. For other podcast episodes of Scriptural Works featuring co-hosts Greg Camp and Patrick Spencer, as well as a variety of different special guests, visit us at scripturalworks.com, YouTube, Apple Podcast, or Spotify. And don't forget to check out the growing repository of podcast companion articles found at scripturalworks.com. And finally, if you find our podcast episodes thought-provoking and helpful, make sure to share them on your social channels.